Ethan was only 12 years old when his life changed completely. His father, Mark, had been a single parent for years after the passing of Ethan's mother. Though Mark did his best to raise Ethan with love and care, he often felt overwhelmed trying to balance work and parenting alone. Hoping to give Ethan a more stable home, Mark decided to remarry. Claire, his new wife, seemed perfect at first glance, kind, charming, and eager to be part of their family. But what no one knew was that beneath her sweet smile hid a side of her personality that would soon turn Ethan's world upside down. The early days of their new family dynamic were filled with hope. Claire moved into their cozy suburban home, bringing with her fresh energy and promises of unity. For Ethan, it was strange having someone new take on the role of mom, but he tried to stay positive. He wanted things to work out for his dad, who deserved happiness after all those lonely years. At first, Claire appeared warm and affectionate toward Ethan. She baked cookies, helped him with homework, and even offered to teach him how to ride a bike better. To Ethan, she seemed like the stepmother anyone would dream of. But little by little, cracks began to show in Claire's polished exterior. It started subtly, a sharp comment here, an unfair demand there. If Ethan forgot to clear his plate after dinner, Claire would sigh dramatically and say, "I guess I'll have to do everything around here myself." When his socks ended up on the living room floor instead of the laundry basket, she muttered under her breath about how messy kids could be. At first, Ethan brushed it off as her way of adjusting to having a child in the house. After all, she wasn't used to being a mom, right? Maybe this was just her learning curve. However, as weeks turned into months, Claire's patience wore thinner. Her tone grew harsher and her expectations became impossible to meet. One Saturday morning, Ethan accidentally knocked over a glass of orange juice while setting the table. Before he could grab a towel to clean it up, Claire snapped, "Why, can't you be more careful? You're such a clumsy boy." Her words stung, especially since his father wasn't home to intervene. Feeling embarrassed, Ethan cleaned up quickly, avoiding eye contact. What made these moments even harder for Ethan was that whenever his father was around, Claire acted completely different. She laughed warmly, complimented Ethan on small achievements, and played the role of the doting stepmom perfectly. Mark never saw the side of Claire that came out when they were alone together, and if Ethan ever hinted at feeling uncomfortable, Claire would twist the situation to make herself look innocent. Once, when Ethan mentioned not liking how strict she was about chores, Claire told Mark, "I'm just trying to teach him responsibility. I don't want him growing up lazy." Ethan found himself caught in a confusing web. On one hand, he loved his father deeply and didn't want to ruin his happiness. On the other hand, living with Claire was becoming unbearable. The tension between them simmered quietly, hidden behind closed doors. Ethan hoped it would go away on its own, but deep down, he feared it might get worse. Little did he know, his worst fears were about to become reality, and nothing would ever be the same again. As time went on, Claire's behavior toward Ethan became increasingly difficult to ignore. What had once been small criticisms and sarcastic remarks began to escalate into something far more troubling. At first, Ethan tried to convince himself that maybe he was overreacting or imagining things. But soon, there was no denying it. Claire's actions were crossing a line, and Ethan felt powerless to stop her. It started with the chores. Claire assigned Ethan an endless list of tasks around the house, far more than any child his age should handle. Every morning before school, he was expected to make his bed perfectly, vacuum the living room, and clean the kitchen counters. After school, she added even more responsibilities, mowing the lawn, folding laundry, and scrubbing the bathroom tiles until they sparkled. If anything was left undone, or if Claire decided it wasn't done well enough, she would scold him, relentlessly. "You're so lazy," she'd say coldly. "I don't know why your father puts up with you." Ethan tried his hardest to keep up, but it seemed impossible to satisfy her. No matter how much effort he put in, Claire always found fault. One evening, after spending hours cleaning the garage, Ethan accidentally knocked over a potted plant while putting tools away. The pot shattered, scattering soil across the floor. Claire stormed in, her face red with anger. "Look what you've done. she shouted. "You ruin everything." Instead of letting him clean it up, she grabbed his arm tightly and dragged him to the corner of the room, ordering him to sit there in silence for an hour as punishment. The punishments grew harsher from there. A spilled glass of milk during breakfast resulted in Ethan being sent to his room without food for the rest of the day. Forgetting to take out the trash one afternoon led to Claire yelling at him for nearly 20 minutes straight, calling him names like stupid and worthless. Each incident chipped away at Ethan's self-esteem, leaving him feeling smaller and more alone with each passing day. One particularly bad evening changed everything. Ethan came home late from soccer practice because the coach had kept the team longer than usual. When he walked through the door, Claire glared at him furiously. "Where have you been?" she demanded. "Do you think I have nothing better to do than wait for you?" Before Ethan could explain, she slapped him hard across the face. Shocked and terrified, Ethan stumbled backward, tears streaming down his cheeks. Without another word, Claire grabbed him by the wrist and shoved him into the basement, locking the door behind her. Trapped in the dark, Ethan sat huddled on the cold concrete floor, shaking uncontrollably. He called out for his father, hoping Mark would hear him and come to help. But the sound of the TV upstairs drowned out his cries. Hours passed before Claire finally opened the door, her expression unreadable. "This is what happens when you disobey me," she said coldly. "Don't let it happen again." For Ethan, that night marked a turning point. The fear inside him grew heavier, weighing down every thought and action. He wanted desperately to tell someone, his dad, his teacher, anyone. But Claire's threats echoed in his mind. "If you say a word to anyone," she warned him later, "no one will believe you. They'll think you're lying, and then you'll really be sorry." Ethan believed her. After all, everyone loved Claire. She was kind to strangers, polite to neighbors, and affectionate toward Mark. Who would ever believe that behind closed doors she was capable of such cruelty? And so Ethan stayed silent, carrying the weight of his secret alone. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this nightmare wouldn't last forever. Something had to give, and when it did, it would change their lives in ways none of them could predict. Ethan's once bright personality began to fade as the days turned into weeks. The constant pressure from Claire's harsh treatment weighed heavily on him, and it wasn't long before the effects started showing in every aspect of his life. At school, his teachers noticed a dramatic change. The boy who used to raise his hand eagerly during class discussions now sat slouched in his chair, staring blankly at his desk. His grades, which had always been decent, began slipping. Homework, assignments were incomplete, and tests that he could have easily passed with a little effort came back marked with red ink. Ms. Carter, Ethan's homeroom teacher, was the first to voice her concerns. She pulled him aside one afternoon after class and asked gently, "Ethan, is everything okay? You seem different lately." Ethan forced a weak smile and shrugged. "I'm fine," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. "Just tired, I guess." Ms. Carter didn't look convinced but decided not to push further, at least not yet. At home, things only grew worse. Claire continued to pile unreasonable demands on Ethan, treating even the smallest mistakes as major offenses. One morning, when Ethan accidentally spilled cereal on the kitchen counter while rushing to get ready for school, Claire exploded. "Can't you do anything right?" she snapped, grabbing him by the shoulder and shoving him toward the mess. "Clean this up now and don't think about eating breakfast either." By the time Ethan arrived at school, he felt drained and defeated, too emotionally exhausted to focus on anything. Ethan's father, Mark, noticed the changes too, but through Claire's lens. Whenever Mark brought up Ethan's declining performance or behavior, Claire quickly stepped in with excuses. "He's just going through a phase," she said smoothly, patting Mark's arm. "You know how kids are at this age. Moody, distracted, lazy." Her words planted seeds of doubt in Mark's mind, making him wonder if maybe Ethan really was struggling because of typical preteen issues, rather than something more serious. Claire took advantage of these moments to paint herself as the responsible one, saying things like, "I try my best to keep him on track, but he doesn't listen to me." Despite her manipulations, Ethan clung to the hope that his father would eventually see through Claire's act. There were times when he wanted so badly to tell Mark the truth, to sit him down and explain everything Claire had done. But fear held him back. Claire's threats echoed in his mind constantly. "If you say anything, no one will believe you." Those words became a prison, trapping Ethan in silence. He convinced himself that speaking out would only make things worse, not just for him but for his dad too. What if Mark refused to believe him? Or worse, what if he sided with Claire? To cope, Ethan withdrew further into himself. He spent less time hanging out with his friends after school and more time alone in his room, lost in books or video games. Even Lucas, his best friend since kindergarten, began to notice the distance. "You've been acting weird lately," Lucas said during lunch one day. "What's going on with you?" Ethan hesitated, staring down at his untouched sandwich. For a moment he considered telling Lucas everything, but then he shook his head. "It's nothing," he lied. "Just stressed about school stuff." As the weeks dragged on, Ethan's world grew smaller. The joy he once found in simple pleasures, playing soccer, laughing with friends, even spending time with his dad, slowly faded away. In its place was a heavy cloud of anxiety and fear, looming over him wherever he went. Yet despite the darkness pressing down on him, Ethan couldn't bring himself to give up completely. Deep inside, a tiny spark of hope remained, a faint belief that someday, somehow, the truth would come out. Until then, he resolved to endure, clinging to the fragile promise that things might one day get better. But unbeknownst to Ethan, forces beyond his control were already beginning to stir. Someone else had started noticing the signs, and they weren't willing to stay silent any longer. Ethan's best friend Lucas had always been the kind of person who noticed things others missed. While most kids were too busy focusing on their own lives, Lucas paid attention, especially when it came to Ethan. They had been inseparable since kindergarten, sharing secrets, laughter, and countless adventures. So when Ethan started acting differently, Lucas knew something was wrong. It wasn't just the way Ethan seemed quieter or how he avoided eye contact during conversations. It was the little things that really worried Lucas. The bruises on Ethan's arms that appeared one day after gym class, the way Ethan flinched whenever someone raised their voice near him, and the constant tiredness in his eyes. At first, Lucas tried to brush it off, thinking maybe Ethan was dealing with stress from school or family issues. But as the days went by, the signs became harder to ignore. One afternoon, after soccer practice, Lucas decided to confront Ethan directly. "Hey," he said, pulling Ethan aside as they walked home together. "You've got to tell me what's going on. You're not yourself lately." Ethan froze for a moment, then forced a smile. "It's nothing, okay? Just stuff at home." His voice trailed off, but Lucas wasn't convinced. "Stuff like what?" Lucas pressed gently. When Ethan didn't answer, Lucas grabbed his arm lightly to get a better look at the bruises. "Did someone do this to you?" Ethan pulled away, quickly, panic flashing in his eyes. "No, I fell, okay? It's no big deal." The lie hung heavy in the air between them, and Lucas could see the fear written all over Ethan's face. Lucas didn't push further. He knew Ethan well, enough to understand that prying wouldn't help right now. Instead, he made a decision. That evening, sitting alone in his room, Lucas did something he'd never done before. He picked up the phone and called Child Protective Services, CPS. He didn't give his name, knowing Ethan would freak out if he found out. All he said was, "There's a kid named Ethan who might be in trouble. Please check on him." A few days later, CPS showed up unannounced at Ethan's house. Claire answered the door, her usual cheerful demeanor firmly in place. She greeted the social worker warmly, inviting her inside while calling Mark to join them. Throughout the visit, Claire played the role of the perfect stepmom flawlessly, offering coffee and explaining how much she cared about Ethan's well-being. Meanwhile, Ethan sat stiffly on the couch, his heart pounding as the social worker asked questions about school, chores, and how he felt at home. Claire smoothly deflected every concern. "Oh, Ethan's such a good boy. she said with a bright smile. He works so hard around the house, doesn't he? Sometimes he forgets things, but we're working on responsibility together. Mark nodded along, clearly trusting Claire's words. The social worker jotted down notes but ultimately left without finding concrete evidence of abuse. For Ethan, the visit was both a relief and a source of frustration. Part of him hoped someone would finally see through Claire's act and rescue him from the nightmare he was living. But another part of him felt defeated, convinced that no one would ever believe him over her. Still, unbeknownst to him, the wheels of change had already started turning. Lucas's anonymous tip hadn't gone unnoticed, and CPS promised to keep an eye on the situation. As the days passed, Claire grew increasingly cautious, sensing that something, or someone, had drawn attention to their household. She dialed back her harsh behavior slightly, careful not to leave any visible marks on Ethan. But even though the worst of her outbursts subsided temporarily, the tension in the house remained thick. Ethan continued to walk on eggshells, unsure of what might set her off next. Meanwhile, Lucas kept watching closely, determined to protect his friend no matter what. Though Ethan still refused to open up, Lucas held on to hope that the truth would eventually come out. And when it did, it would change everything. Until then, he vowed to stay by Ethan's side, ready to act if things took a turn for the worse. Little did either of them know, the storm they had been dreading was closer than they realized, and it would hit hard enough to shatter the fragile peace they had been clinging to. The tension in Ethan's house had reached a boiling point, though no one could see it from the outside. Claire's careful facade had returned full force after the CPS visit, but her anger simmered just beneath the surface, ready to explode at any moment. For Ethan, every day felt like walking through a minefield. He never knew what might set her off. And then, one stormy evening, everything came crashing down. It started with something small, as these things often do. That afternoon, Mark had gone out to pick up groceries, leaving Ethan and Claire alone at home. The rain pounded against the windows, and the wind howled through the trees, making the house feel eerily quiet despite the chaos outside. Claire had given Ethan a long list of chores to finish before dinner, including cleaning the kitchen floor and organizing the living room shelves. Ethan worked quickly, knowing that even the smallest delay could provoke her wrath. But as he wiped down the counters, his hands trembled from exhaustion, and he accidentally knocked over a vase sitting near the edge. The crash echoed through the house, shattering the silence. Ethan froze, staring at the broken pieces scattered across the floor. His heart sank. He knew this wasn't going to end well. Before he could even bend down to start picking up the shards, Claire stormed into the room, her face twisted with rage. "What have you done now?" she screamed, grabbing him by the arm so tightly it hurt. "That was expensive. Do you know how careless you are?" Ethan tried to apologize, tears welling up in his eyes. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." But Claire cut him off, shaking him roughly. "Sorry doesn't fix anything," she shouted, her voice sharp and cutting. She shoved him hard enough to send him stumbling backward, and he fell onto the floor, landing among the shattered glass. Panic surged through him as Claire loomed over him, yelling about how useless and ungrateful he was. Unbeknownst to either of them, Mark had returned home earlier than expected. He stood frozen at the top of the stairs, grocery bag still in hand, listening to the commotion below. At first he thought maybe they were arguing over something trivial, a spilled drink or a forgotten chore. But as Claire's voice grew louder and more venomous, his blood ran cold. Slowly, quietly, he descended the stairs, peering around the corner just in time to see Claire shove Ethan again. Mark's breath caught in his throat. What he saw in that moment shattered the image of Claire he'd built in his mind, the loving stepmom who cared for his son and kept their home running smoothly. This was someone else entirely, cruel, violent, and completely out of control. Without thinking, Mark rushed forward, pulling Claire away from Ethan. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice trembling with shock and fury. Claire spun around, her expression shifting instantly from rage to fake innocence. "Mark, thank goodness you're here," she said, her tone sugary sweet. "Ethan broke your favorite vase, and I was just trying to explain why we can't afford to replace things all the time." Her words dripped with manipulation, but Mark wasn't falling for it, not this time. "Don't lie to me," Mark snapped, his voice firm. "I heard everything. I saw what you did." He turned to Ethan, who was still on the floor, crying silently. Kneeling beside him, Mark placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay, buddy?" Ethan nodded weakly, too overwhelmed to speak. For the first time in months, he felt safe, not because the danger was gone, but because his father was finally seeing the truth. Claire tried to protest, her voice rising hysterically. "You don't understand. He needs discipline, Mark. Someone has to teach him right from wrong." But Mark wasn't listening anymore. His focus was entirely on Ethan, whose tear-streaked face told a story far more powerful than Claire's lies ever could. In that moment, Mark realized just how much damage Claire had caused, and how blind he'd been to it all along. As the storm raged outside, another kind of storm brewed inside the house. Mark helped Ethan to his feet, wrapping an arm protectively around him. Then, turning back to Claire, he spoke in a voice colder than the rain pelting the windows. "Get out," he said simply. "Now." Claire's eyes widened in disbelief as Mark's words hung heavy in the air. "Get out," he repeated, his voice steady but laced with anger. For a moment, she seemed frozen, her polished mask slipping to reveal raw panic. Then, regaining her composure, she tried one last desperate attempt to manipulate the situation. "Mark, you're making a huge mistake," she said, her tone pleading yet condescending. "You don't know what you're doing. He's turning you against me." But Mark wasn't swayed. The sight of Ethan trembling on the floor, bruised and broken emotionally, had shattered any lingering doubt about Claire's true nature. "Don't," he warned sharply, cutting her off before she could continue. "I've heard enough. Pack your things and leave. You're not welcome here anymore." Ethan watched silently from behind his father, clutching the sleeve of Mark's shirt like it was a lifeline. His heart raced, part relief, part fear that Claire might fight back or refuse to go. But Claire knew when she'd been defeated. With a bitter glare, she stormed upstairs, slamming doors as she began packing her belongings. The sound of her movements echoed through the house, each thud feeling like another step toward freedom for Ethan. As Claire packed, Mark sat down with Ethan in the living room. For the first time in months, Ethan felt safe enough to let his guard down completely. Tears streamed down his face as he finally told his father everything: the punishments, the insults, the constant fear. Mark listened intently, his jaw tightening as the full weight of Claire's cruelty sank in. When Ethan finished speaking, Mark pulled him into a tight hug, holding him like he hadn't done since Ethan was a little boy. "I'm so sorry, buddy," Mark whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have seen this sooner. I failed you, and I'll never forgive myself for that." Ethan shook his head fiercely. "It's not your fault, Dad," he murmured between sobs. "You didn't know." Though guilt still gnawed at Mark, hearing those words gave him the strength to focus on what mattered most: protecting his son. An hour later, Claire reappeared at the top of the stairs, dragging 2 suitcases behind her. Her expression was icy, her eyes darting between Mark and Ethan with a mixture of hatred and defiance. "This isn't over," she spat venomously, though it was clear she was trying to save face. Mark didn't respond. Instead, he walked to the front door and held it open, his stance firm and unyielding. Without another word, Claire stepped outside, slamming the door shut behind her. The silence that followed was deafening. For a few moments, neither Mark nor Ethan moved. They simply stood there staring at the closed door as if waiting for it to burst open again. But it didn't. Finally, Mark turned to Ethan, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We're going to be okay," he said, softly. "Things are going to change around here, starting today." Over the next few days, Mark took immediate steps to ensure Ethan's safety and well-being. He contacted a therapist specializing in child trauma and scheduled sessions for Ethan to help him process everything he'd endured. Mark also reached out to CPS again, providing them with detailed accounts of Claire's behavior based on Ethan's testimony. This time, armed with concrete evidence and Mark's cooperation, CPS launched a formal investigation. Meanwhile, Life at home slowly began to improve. Mark made a conscious effort to spend more quality time with Ethan, cooking meals together, playing board games, and even taking weekend trips to the park. It wasn't easy. Ethan still flinched sometimes when someone raised their voice, and trust didn't come overnight, but progress was visible. The walls Ethan had built around himself started to crumble, replaced by tentative smiles and quiet laughter. One evening, as they sat together on the couch watching TV, Ethan looked up at his dad hesitantly. Do you think she'll try to come back?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark put an arm around him reassuringly. "No, buddy. She won't hurt you again, I promise." And for the first time in a long time, Ethan believed him. Though the scars of the past would take time to heal, one thing was certain. Ethan and Mark were stronger together. With Claire gone, they had a chance to rebuild, not just their relationship, but their lives. And while the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, they faced it side by side, ready to move forward into brighter days. The weeks that followed Claire's departure were a whirlwind of change for Ethan and his father. The police investigation into Claire's abuse moved quickly, thanks to the evidence provided by CPS and Mark's unwavering support. Officers interviewed Ethan multiple times, asking him to recount every detail of what he'd endured. Though it was painful to relive those memories, Ethan found comfort in knowing that this time, someone was truly listening and determined to make things right. Claire, meanwhile, tried to deny everything at first. When questioned by investigators, she painted herself as the victim of a misunderstanding, claiming Ethan had exaggerated her discipline tactics. But as more information came to light, including accounts from neighbors who had overheard her, shouting matches with Ethan, and photographic evidence of bruises CPS documented during their earlier visit, her story began to crumble. Eventually, under mounting pressure, Claire admitted to some of her actions. "I was just trying to teach him responsibility," she insisted during one heated interrogation. "He needed boundaries." Her excuses fell flat, especially when confronted with Ethan's tearful testimony about the fear and pain she had inflicted on him. The trial took place several months later, and Ethan was called to testify. Standing in the courtroom, surrounded by strangers and facing Claire across the room, he felt his heart pounding like a drum. For a moment, doubt crept in. What if they didn't believe him? What if Claire somehow twisted the truth again? But then he glanced at his father sitting in the front row, giving him an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, Ethan spoke clearly and honestly, sharing every painful memory without flinching. By the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. When the verdict was announced, justice finally prevailed. Claire was found guilty of child endangerment and sentenced to 3 years in prison, with mandatory counseling upon release. The judge emphasized that her actions were unacceptable and warned her against ever working in a caregiving role again. As Claire was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't happiness, not exactly, but rather a sense of closure. The woman who had made his life a nightmare was no longer free to hurt him, or anyone else. With Claire behind bars, Ethan and Mark focused on rebuilding their lives. Therapy became a cornerstone of their healing process. Ethan attended weekly sessions where he learned coping strategies to deal with anxiety and trust issues. Slowly but surely, he began to open up about his feelings, realizing it was okay to be vulnerable. His therapist praised his resilience, telling him how brave he was for speaking out and seeking help. Those words meant the world to Ethan, reinforcing the idea that he wasn't alone in his journey. Mark also joined family counseling sessions, eager to repair the bond he feared he'd damaged by not seeing the signs sooner. Together, they worked through moments of guilt and frustration, learning healthier ways to communicate and support each other. One breakthrough came when Mark admitted how much he regretted trusting Claire blindly. "I let my loneliness cloud my judgment," he confessed during one session. "But I promise you, Ethan, I'll never let anything like this happen again." Ethan nodded, accepting his apology. Forgiveness didn't come instantly, but it grew stronger with each passing day. Outside of therapy, life started to feel lighter. Mark surprised Ethan with small gestures, a new soccer ball to reignite his love for the sport, movie nights with popcorn and blankets, and even a trip to a local amusement park. Laughter returned to their home, filling spaces once dominated by tension and fear. Ethan's grades improved, and he reconnected with Lucas, who cheered him on as he slowly regained his confidence. By the end of the year, Ethan stood taller, both physically and emotionally. He still carried scars, some visible, others hidden, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they reminded him of how far he'd come and the strength he'd discovered within himself. With his father by his side, Ethan looked toward the future with hope, ready to embrace whatever challenges lay ahead. Life wouldn't always be perfect, but for the first time in a long time, it felt possible. Months after the trial, Ethan and Mark decided it was time for a fresh start. The house they had once shared with Claire still held too many painful memories, echoes of raised voices, slammed doors, and sleepless nights. So they packed up their belongings and moved to a new town, eager to leave the past behind and build a life free from shadows. It wasn't an easy decision, but both father and son agreed it was necessary for their healing. The new house was smaller but cozy, with large windows that let in plenty of sunlight. Ethan chose his room himself, a corner space with a view of the backyard where trees swayed gently in the breeze. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of ownership over his own life. Decorating the walls with posters of his favorite sports teams and books he loved, Ethan slowly began to reclaim pieces of himself that had been lost during those dark months. Each nail hammered into the wall felt like another step toward freedom at a meeting. School, Ethan found solace in making new friends. Though he was nervous at first, worrying about being judged or misunderstood, he quickly discovered that people responded to his quiet kindness. He joined the soccer team again, encouraged by his dad, and soon became known for his determination on the field. His teammates admired how hard he worked, never giving up even when things got tough. "You've got heart, kid," the coach told him one afternoon after practice. Those simple words made Ethan beam with pride. It was proof that he was more than just a victim. He was a survivor. Mark, too, embraced their new beginning. He threw himself into work, excelling in his job as a project manager, while also carving out time for hobbies he'd neglected for years. On weekends, he took Ethan fishing at a nearby lake, teaching him how to cast a line and patiently waiting as they sat together in companionable silence. These moments became sacred to them, a reminder of how far they'd come since the days when fear ruled their lives. As the seasons changed, so did their relationship. Gone were the awkward silences and unspoken tensions that had lingered during the early days of recovery. In their place grew a deeper connection, one built on trust, honesty, and mutual respect. They talked openly now, sharing stories, dreams, and fears without hesitation. One evening, sitting on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan turned to his dad. "Do you think we'll always be okay?" he asked softly. Mark smiled, resting a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "We might have bad days ahead, buddy. Life isn't perfect, but as long as we stick together, I know we'll get through anything." Ethan nodded, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. It wasn't just his dad's words that reassured him. It was the unwavering love behind them. In the months that followed, Ethan continued to thrive. His grades improved, and he started volunteering at a local animal shelter, finding joy in caring for creatures who couldn't speak for themselves. It gave him a sense of purpose, knowing he could make a difference no matter how small. Meanwhile, Mark reconnected with old friends and even started dating casually, introducing Ethan to each person slowly and ensuring his son felt comfortable every step of the way. Though scars remained, both visible and invisible, they served as reminders of resilience rather than pain. Ethan often thought about the journey that had brought him here, the fear, the courage, the moments of doubt, and ultimately, the triumph of truth and justice. He realized that while the past would always be part of him, it didn't control him anymore. With his dad by his side, he had learned to face challenges head-on, armed with strength he hadn't known he possessed. One crisp autumn evening, as golden leaves danced in the wind, Ethan stood in the backyard watching the sunset. His father joined him, handing over a mug of hot chocolate. Together they watched the sky transform into shades of orange and pink, painting the world in hues of hope. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt truly at peace. Life wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that was enough.